The morning sun reflected against the tall glass windows of the huge company building, where hundreds of employees rushed in and out, carrying files, typing on their phones, or waiting for the elevators. Among them, a man walked with a calm but firm stride. His name was Adrian Parker, the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the city. Everyone around him knew his reputation: powerful, intelligent, respected, but also distant and cold. He was the kind of man who never wasted a second of his time, who never stopped to greet or smile, and whose presence made people step aside without him saying a word. That morning seemed no different from the others. Adrian entered the lobby with his usual confidence, his black suit perfectly pressed, his shoes shining, and his eyes focused ahead. His assistant walked behind him, holding his schedule for the day, ready to remind him of his meetings. The atmosphere in the lobby was full of hushed whispers as employees glanced at their boss, making sure they didn't stand in his way. But then, something completely unexpected happened. As Adrian passed the sitting area of the lobby, a small voice rose above the silence. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood from her chair, holding a small teddy bear in her arms. She looked straight at him with wide, innocent eyes, and before anyone could understand what was happening, she asked loudly, "Are you my daddy?" The entire lobby froze. The sound of heels clicking on the floor, the chatter of the employees, even the receptionist typing on the computer, all of it stopped at once. People stared at the child in shock, their mouths slightly open, waiting to see what the powerful CEO would say. It was as if the whole building held its breath. Adrian stopped walking. His assistant almost bumped into him, surprised by the sudden pause. Slowly, Adrian turned his head toward the voice, and his eyes landed on the little girl. For a brief second, the confident, untouchable businessman seemed uncertain. His eyebrows drew together, and he looked at her with confusion. The girl's eyes were round and filled with curiosity. She didn't look scared or shy, instead, she looked hopeful. Her teddy bear hung loosely by her side as she tilted her head and repeated softly, "Are you my daddy?" Adrian didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man who dealt with children. In fact, he barely had time for anything outside of his work. His life was built on schedules, contracts, meetings, and endless goals. Children, laughter, and innocent questions didn't belong in his world. Yet, there he was, staring at this little girl who seemed strangely familiar. "No," he finally replied, his voice calm but slightly unsure. "I don't think so." But even as he said the words, something inside him felt unsettled. There was a flicker in his chest, a strange feeling that he couldn't name. He told himself it was nothing, just a random question from a child who didn't know any better. Still, his eyes lingered on her face longer than he intended. Before the silence could stretch too far, a young woman came rushing forward. She looked nervous and embarrassed, her hair tied back neatly but a few strands falling loose as she hurried toward her daughter. She knelt down beside the girl and whispered something quickly, her hand gently resting on the child's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, turning her gaze to Adrian. "She didn't mean to disturb you. Please forgive her." Adrian studied the woman for a moment. There was something about her face, something he couldn't quite place but felt oddly familiar. She held her daughter close, clearly uncomfortable with the scene that had just unfolded in front of so many people. The little girl, however, didn't seem embarrassed at all. She hugged her teddy bear again and looked at Adrian with wide eyes. For some reason, she seemed convinced he was connected to her, even though he had denied it. Adrian nodded slowly, trying to regain his usual composure. "It's fine," he said in a cool tone, though his mind was still clouded with questions. He turned to continue walking, but he couldn't stop himself from glancing back at the pair one last time. The mother guided her daughter to sit down again, whispering softly to calm her. Employees around the lobby tried to act as if nothing had happened, but whispers had already started to spread. Some stole quick glances at their boss, curious about his reaction. Others shook their heads, unsure of what to make of the scene. Adrian stepped into the elevator, his assistant pressing the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, Adrian's reflection stared back at him in the mirror-like walls. For the first time in a long while, his thoughts were not about business deals or numbers. Instead, they were about the little girl's innocent face, her soft question echoing in his ears, "Are you my daddy?" The elevator rose steadily, but his mind felt unsteady. He tried to shake off the thought, reminding himself he had work to do. But something deep inside whispered that the question wasn't as simple as it seemed. There had been something in her eyes, something familiar that tugged at his heart in a way he hadn't felt in years. He sat in his office later, staring at the city skyline through the wide glass windows. His assistant reminded him of his meeting, but Adrian hardly listened. Instead, his mind replayed the moment in the lobby over and over. The girl's voice, the mother's face, the shock in the air, it all stayed with him. For a man who believed in control, in never being surprised by anything, this small encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. And as he leaned back in his chair, he knew one thing for certain: his morning had not been ordinary. That little girl, with her teddy bear and her innocent question, had opened a door to something he didn't yet understand. And deep inside, though he didn't want to admit it, a strange and quiet voice inside him wondered what if, just what if, she wasn't entirely wrong. The day after the surprising encounter in the lobby, Adrian Parker found himself more distracted than usual. Normally, he would forget about small incidents quickly, burying himself in work and meetings, but this time was different. The image of the little girl's eyes kept appearing in his mind, as if they were following him even when he sat in his quiet office. He remembered her soft voice, the way she asked the question so boldly, without fear or hesitation. It wasn't just the question itself that unsettled him, it was the feeling he got when he looked at her, like she was somehow connected to him in a way he couldn't explain. That morning, as he entered the lobby again, he noticed the same woman and the same little girl sitting in the waiting area. The child was holding her teddy bear tightly, swinging her feet back and forth as she sat on the chair. Her mother, looking nervous but determined, was reviewing a folder of papers on her lap. Adrian slowed down as he passed them, his steps almost hesitating. It was unusual for him to pay attention to anyone in the lobby, but he couldn't stop himself from glancing in their direction. The woman noticed him and quickly lowered her eyes, as though she didn't want to draw any attention. But the little girl noticed him immediately. Her face lit up, and she gave him a smile so pure that it surprised him. She didn't say anything this time, but her gaze followed him as he walked past. Adrian's assistant leaned close and whispered, "Sir, that woman is here for the junior manager interview. Her name is Emily Hart. She's scheduled for later today." Something inside Adrian froze when he heard the name. Emily Hart. It sounded familiar, too familiar. He didn't let his reaction show, keeping his face calm as always, but inside, memories stirred. He remembered a young woman from his college days, someone who had once been important to him before life had pulled them in different directions. Could it really be her? Adrian spent the morning distracted, glancing at his schedule but hardly reading it. He kept thinking about the mother and the child. He remembered how Emily had looked at him yesterday, embarrassed, apologizing for her daughter's words. The resemblance between her and the woman from his past was difficult to ignore. The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. When it was finally time for the interview, Adrian decided to sit in on it, something he rarely did for junior-level positions. His assistant was surprised but didn't question him. In the small meeting room, Emily sat nervously across from the interview panel. She held her papers tightly, but her voice was steady as she answered their questions. Adrian watched her carefully. Her expressions, the way she spoke, the kindness in her eyes, it all reminded him of the Emily he had known years ago. As the interview continued, Adrian barely listened to her qualifications. Instead, he was studying her, silently comparing the past to the present. And when the little girl's face flashed in his mind again, the pieces began to connect in a way that unsettled him deeply. After the interview, Emily thanked the panel politely and stepped out. Adrian remained seated, his expression unreadable, but inside, questions roared through his mind. Could this child really be his? Had Emily kept such a secret from him all these years? The thought made his chest tighten with confusion, frustration, and something else he couldn't name. Later that afternoon, as Adrian was leaving his office, he saw Emily and her daughter again in the lobby. The little girl ran a few steps ahead, clutching her teddy bear, her bright eyes full of excitement as she spotted him. "Hi," she said cheerfully, as if they already knew each other. Adrian stopped, surprised by her energy. He gave a small nod, unsure how to respond. Emily hurried forward, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I'm sorry again about yesterday," she said softly, looking embarrassed. "Children sometimes say things without thinking. Please don't take it seriously." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. He could see she was nervous, but there was also strength in the way she carried herself. He wanted to ask her so many questions. Where had she been all these years? Why had she never reached out? And most of all, why did her daughter's eyes look so much like his own when he was younger? Instead, he simply said, "It's fine." His voice was calm, but his mind was far from it. The little girl smiled at him again, as though she could sense something her mother couldn't. Then she tugged at Emily's hand and whispered something that made her mother blush slightly. Adrian didn't hear the words, but he guessed it had something to do with him. As they walked away, Adrian stood there, lost in thought. He had always been in control of his life, planning every step, never letting emotions guide him. But now, everything felt uncertain. The question the little girl had asked yesterday wasn't leaving his mind, it was echoing louder with each passing hour. That night, back at his penthouse apartment, Adrian sat alone in his living room, the city lights glowing outside the tall windows. He held a glass of water in his hand but barely touched it. Instead, he thought about Emily. He remembered the days in college when she used to laugh at his serious nature, telling him he needed to live a little more. He remembered how she always carried a notebook filled with her dreams, while he was busy chasing grades and ambitions. They had cared for each other deeply once, but he had chosen his career over everything else, and slowly, their paths had drifted apart. Now, years later, she had appeared again with a daughter who might or might not be his. The thought unsettled him more than anything else ever had. The next day, Adrian called his assistant and asked for a detailed background check on Emily Hart. He knew it was invasive, but he couldn't ignore the storm of questions inside him. He needed answers. By the afternoon, the assistant returned with the file. Adrian sat in his office, reading through it carefully. Emily had lived in the same city as him during the years after college. The dates aligned in a way that made his chest tighten. She had never married, and she had a daughter named Lily, who was 6 years old. 6 years old. Adrian closed the file slowly, leaning back in his chair. His heart pounded as the truth began to feel closer, though he still didn't have confirmation. He thought about Lily's eyes again, the way they seemed so familiar, and for the first time in years, the powerful CEO felt completely uncertain about what to do next. In the days that followed, he noticed Emily and Lily more often. Sometimes, while waiting for her mother, Lily would sit in the lobby drawing on a small notebook. Adrian found himself pausing just a little, watching her from a distance. Once, when he passed by, she held up her drawing proudly, a simple sketch of a man, a woman, and a child holding hands. She looked at him with a hopeful smile, and though Adrian didn't say anything, the picture stayed with him long after he returned to his office. Slowly, something inside him began to change. The cold walls he had built around his heart over the years started to crack. The little girl's presence, her innocence, and her bold question were softening him in ways he had never imagined possible. And though he still didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for sure: his life was no longer as simple as it had been before. Adrian Parker had never been the kind of man to doubt his own decisions. Every move he made in business was calculated, precise, and carefully thought through. But now, with the image of a 6-year-old girl's innocent face constantly appearing in his mind, he felt unsettled in a way he couldn't explain. The more he tried to focus on his work, the more distracted he became. Numbers, contracts, presentations, none of it held his full attention anymore. Instead, all he could think about was Lily and her bold question in the lobby. He told himself it was just curiosity, that he simply wanted to clear up the misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something inside him had been stirred, something he had buried years ago: the possibility of a life outside of endless boardrooms and profits. After receiving the background file on Emily Hart, he couldn't ignore the facts. The timelines matched. She had lived in the same city as him around the time they had last seen each other, and she had never married. Her daughter was 6 years old. The math was impossible to ignore. Adrian spent late nights in his penthouse staring out at the city, questioning everything he had once been certain about. If Lily was his daughter, what did that mean for the life he had built? Could he simply step in after so many years? Would Emily even let him? And why had she kept it from him all this time? The following morning, Adrian made a decision he normally would have thought beneath him. He asked his assistant not only to gather professional information but also to quietly observe Emily and Lily. He wanted to know where they lived, how they spent their days, and what kind of life they led. It was a line he had never crossed before in his personal life, but he felt desperate for answers. Over the next week, small details trickled in. Emily and Lily lived in a modest apartment across town. Emily worked part-time jobs before applying for the position at his company, and despite the struggles, she had managed to provide a warm, stable life for her daughter. Adrian read every detail carefully, his chest tightening with each page. He could see the strength it must have taken for Emily to raise a child alone, and he could also see how much love Lily had grown up with, even without a father. But there was still one piece missing: the truth. One afternoon, Adrian walked through the lobby on his way to a meeting. As usual, Lily was sitting on one of the chairs while Emily spoke quietly to a receptionist about some paperwork. The little girl was drawing in her notebook again, humming to herself. This time, Adrian slowed down, unable to resist the pull. "What are you drawing?" he asked, surprising himself as much as her. Lily looked up at him, her big eyes shining. She held up the paper. "It's a family," she said proudly. Adrian looked at the simple picture. A man, a woman, and a little girl stood holding hands under a bright sun. He felt his throat tighten. "It's very nice," he said softly, his usual cold tone replaced with something gentler. Lily grinned, clearly pleased with his words. "That's me," she pointed to the little girl in the picture. Then she pointed to the man. "That's my daddy." She paused and looked at Adrian with a serious expression, as if waiting for him to understand something. Before he could respond, Emily returned, quickly noticing the interaction. She looked uncomfortable, but Adrian could see a flicker of something else in her eyes: hesitation, maybe even fear. "Come on, Lily," she said quickly, gently taking her daughter's hand. "We shouldn't bother Mr. Parker." Adrian wanted to speak, to ask her directly, but he couldn't bring himself to do it there, in front of everyone. Instead, he simply nodded and walked away, though the drawing stayed in his mind long after he had left. That evening, alone in his office, Adrian finally admitted to himself what he had been trying to avoid. He couldn't keep pretending this was just coincidence. He had to know the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the answer, but the uncertainty was worse than anything else. The next day, he called Emily into his office under the pretense of discussing her interview results. When she walked in, she looked surprised to see only him waiting. He gestured for her to sit, his expression calm, though his heart was racing. "You did well in your interview," Adrian began slowly. The panel was impressed. "Thank you," Emily replied politely, her hands clasped in her lap. There was a long pause before Adrian leaned forward slightly. "Emily, do you remember me?" Her eyes flickered with something: recognition, sadness, maybe even regret. "Yes," she said softly. "I do." The air grew heavy between them. Years of unspoken words seemed to hang in the silence. Finally, Adrian asked the question that had been haunting him. "Is she, my daughter?" Emily's hands tightened on her lap. She lowered her eyes, and for a long moment, she didn't answer. Adrian's chest tightened with each passing second. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The single word hit him harder than anything in his entire career ever had. For a moment, he couldn't speak. All the walls he had built around himself felt like they were collapsing at once. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice sharper now, though beneath it was hurt. Emily lifted her eyes to his, her expression filled with quiet strength. "Because you made it clear what you wanted back then. You wanted success, not family. I didn't want to hold you back, Adrian. I decided to raise her on my own." Her words cut through him, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He remembered the young man he had been: ambitious, restless, unwilling to let anything get in the way of his goals. He had walked away from love, believing there would always be time later. But life had moved on without him, and now here he was, years later, facing the consequences of his choices. "I didn't know," Adrian said quietly, almost to himself. All this time, Emily's expression softened slightly. "She's a happy child, Adrian. She's grown up loved. That's what matters." But Adrian couldn't stop thinking about all the moments he had missed: her first steps, her first words, the birthdays, the little drawings. The guilt weighed heavily on him. For a man who had everything, he suddenly felt like he had lost more than he could ever gain back. That night, Adrian sat alone once again, but the city lights outside no longer gave him comfort. Instead, they felt cold and distant. In his hand, he held the small drawing Lily had left behind earlier in the day. The simple image of a family holding hands made his chest ache. For the first time in his life, Adrian Parker, the man who always knew what to do, felt completely lost. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a quiet determination began to grow. He didn't know how he would do it, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't walk away this time. The following days were unlike anything Adrian Parker had ever experienced. Normally, his life followed a clear rhythm: morning meetings, decisions that affected millions, constant deadlines, and evenings spent alone in his penthouse. But now, that rhythm was broken. Everything he thought he understood about himself felt uncertain. The truth Emily had confessed kept echoing in his mind. Lily was his daughter. His daughter. The words felt heavy, almost unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life and not his own. Every time he looked at his reflection, he found himself searching for traces of Lily in his own face. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when she asked a question, all of it seemed to reflect pieces of him that he had never expected to see in a child. He realized with a deep ache that he had missed 6 precious years of her life, years that could never be returned. At work, he found it impossible to keep the same focus. In the middle of boardroom discussions, he would suddenly think of Lily's small voice saying, "That's my daddy." During late-night reviews of financial reports, his mind would wander back to Emily's tired but proud eyes when she admitted she had raised their daughter alone. For a man who once prided himself on discipline and control, Adrian now felt as though he was standing on unsteady ground. Finally, one evening, he called Emily and asked her to meet him privately. She hesitated at first, unsure of what he wanted to say, but eventually agreed. They met at a quiet cafe away from the busy city center. It wasn't a place Adrian would normally visit, but he wanted somewhere simple, where the weight of his name and his position didn't hang over them. When Emily arrived, she looked the same as she had in his office, calm, composed, but with an undercurrent of nerves. Adrian watched her sit across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was filled with years of unspoken memories. "I don't even know where to begin," Adrian admitted at last, his voice lower than usual. "You should have told me." Emily looked down at her tea, her fingers tightening on the cup. "And what would you have done, Adrian? Back then, you made it very clear that your future didn't include me. You were chasing a life that had no room for family. If I had told you, maybe you would have felt guilty, maybe you would have done something out of obligation but not love. I didn't want Lily to grow up feeling like a burden." Her words stung because they were true. Adrian remembered those younger years when ambition had consumed him entirely. He had been blind to everything else. "I don't deny I was selfish," he said slowly. "But I had the right to know." Emily finally met his eyes. "And I had the right to protect my child. You can be angry with me, Adrian, but please don't forget she is not just your daughter. She is my entire world. Everything I have done these past years has been for her." Adrian leaned back, his jaw tight. He couldn't argue with that. He had seen the proof himself in the way Lily looked at her mother, the way she smiled with absolute trust and love. Emily had given her everything, even when she had so little. The conversation grew heavier. Adrian asked about the years he had missed, the first steps, the birthdays, the school recitals. Emily told him gently, sometimes with a small smile, sometimes with tears in her eyes. Every detail cut deeper into Adrian's heart. He pictured Lily taking her first steps, falling and laughing, while he had been sitting in some meeting across the country. He pictured her blowing out birthday candles surrounded only by her mother and maybe a few friends, while he had been making deals in shining towers. The more he listened, the more the regret grew inside him, like a weight pressing down on his chest. "I can't get those years back," Adrian said quietly, almost to himself. "But I don't want to miss another one." Emily studied him carefully. "You say that now, but Lily is not an accessory to add to your life, Adrian. She's a child. She needs consistency, love, patience. Can you give her that? Or will you disappear the moment work calls you away?" Her question pierced straight to the truth. Adrian had always placed his career above everything else. But for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could continue living like that. The thought of walking away from Lily now felt unbearable. "I want to try," he said firmly. "I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I won't abandon her. Not this time." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out the cafe window, her thoughts clearly conflicted. Finally, she sighed. "We'll see. For now, let's take things slowly. She doesn't fully understand who you are yet. To her, you're just the man she met in the lobby who looks familiar. If we tell her the truth, it has to be at the right time, in the right way." Adrian nodded, though the impatience inside him was strong. He wanted to hold Lily and tell her everything, to make up for all the years he had missed. But Emily was right. This wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what was best for Lily. That night, back at his penthouse, Adrian sat in silence. The city lights sparkled outside, but they no longer impressed him. He thought about how empty his grand home felt, how lonely the vast rooms were. For the first time in years, the success that had once felt so important seemed hollow. What good was wealth if it couldn't buy back the laughter of a child? What good was power if it couldn't fill the silence at night? Over the next few days, Adrian began to change in small ways. Instead of rushing straight to his office in the mornings, he sometimes stopped in the lobby and greeted Lily with a smile. She would show him her drawings or tell him about her day in school, and though their conversations were simple, they warmed him more than any business victory ever had. Emily watched carefully, cautious but also surprised at the softness she saw in him. One afternoon, when Lily proudly showed him a picture she had drawn of a castle, Adrian asked, "Would you like me to take you to see a real one someday?" Her eyes lit up, and she nodded eagerly. The pure excitement on her face made his heart swell. He realized that for the first time in his life, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with money or success. Still, beneath the joy, there was a shadow of guilt. Every laugh, every smile, every innocent word from Lily reminded him of what he had missed. No matter how much he tried, he could never erase the past. One evening, after another long day, Adrian sat alone again, but instead of feeling restless, he felt determined. He couldn't undo his mistakes, but he could choose differently now. He could choose to be present. For a man who had built an empire, Adrian Parker realized his greatest challenge was not in business, but in learning how to be a father. And though he was filled with fear and uncertainty, he also felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Days turned into weeks, and Adrian Parker slowly began to see the world differently. Where once he had measured his life in contracts, profits, and deadlines, he now found himself measuring time in smiles, small conversations, and the quiet joy of simply being noticed by a little girl who didn't yet fully know what he was to her. Each morning when he entered the lobby, he found himself looking for her. Sometimes Lily was there, waiting with her teddy bear, and she would wave the moment she saw him. Other days, she would be drawing, her feet swinging under the chair, and she would proudly hold up her sketches for him to see. Adrian discovered he enjoyed these moments more than anything else in his day. Even a 30-second exchange with her left him feeling lighter, as though some heavy weight had lifted off his shoulders. Emily watched quietly, cautious but not interfering. She had expected Adrian to lose interest quickly, to get too busy with his endless work, but to her surprise, he kept showing up. Even if it was only for a short time, even if he had meetings stacked one after another, he always found a moment for Lily. One Friday evening, Adrian asked Emily if he could take them both to dinner. After a moment's hesitation, she agreed. They went to a family restaurant, nothing fancy, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt like a different man. Lily sat between them, talking endlessly about her school, her drawings, and the stories she loved to hear at night. Adrian listened with genuine interest, laughing at her little jokes and asking questions that made her feel proud. At one point, Lily looked at him seriously and asked, "Why don't you smile more? You look nicer when you smile." Her words made both adults pause. Emily hid a small laugh, while Adrian actually smiled wider, realizing she was right. He had lived so long with a serious face that he had forgotten what it felt like to smile naturally. That night, when they left the restaurant, Lily held his hand without hesitation. The simple, innocent trust of that gesture shook him deeply. He looked down at her small fingers wrapped around his, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: peace. As the weeks went on, Adrian began to change in ways even his employees noticed. The once cold and untouchable CEO now seemed more approachable. He still worked hard, but he no longer allowed his entire life to be consumed by it. He started leaving the office earlier some days, choosing instead to spend time with Lily and Emily. Sometimes they went to the park. Sometimes they had ice cream together. Other times, he simply sat and listened as Lily told him stories about her day. One Saturday morning, Adrian invited them both to his penthouse. Emily hesitated, but Lily was excited to see the place she imagined must be like a castle. When they arrived, Adrian suddenly realized how empty his grand home looked through the eyes of a child. The tall windows, the polished floors, the expensive furniture, none of it felt warm or welcoming. Lily walked around curiously, her teddy bear in her arms, and then she looked at him with honest innocence. "Why don't you have any pictures?" she asked. Adrian frowned slightly. "Pictures? Yeah," she said. "Like of people you love. Mommy has lots at home. You don't have any." The truth of her words struck him hard. For all his wealth, he didn't have a single photo on his walls, no sign of family, no sign of a life filled with people. Just silence and space. That night, after they left, Adrian sat alone staring at the empty frames he had never bothered to fill. For the first time, the loneliness of his home was unbearable. He realized then that his wealth had built him walls but not happiness. He thought of Lily's smile, her laughter, and how alive his home had felt when she had been there. Slowly but surely, Adrian began to let down the walls he had built for so long. He told Emily he wanted to be a part of Lily's life, not just as a visitor but as a father. Emily hesitated, protecting her daughter as she always had, but she couldn't deny the change she saw in him. Adrian wasn't the same man she had once known. He was softer, humbler, and more present. He began attending small moments in Lily's life: her school recital, her art show, her soccer game. Each time, Lily's face lit up when she saw him there, and Adrian realized these were the victories that truly mattered. Sitting in a crowded school hall, clapping proudly as his daughter sang a song on stage, brought him more pride than any award or business deal ever had. Still, the guilt of the years he had missed weighed on him. One evening, he sat with Emily after Lily had gone to bed. The apartment was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the city outside. Adrian finally spoke what had been on his heart for so long. "I can't change the past," he said quietly. "And I'll never forgive myself for not being there. But I want to spend the rest of my life making sure she knows she's loved. I want her to know she matters more than anything I've ever built." Emily looked at him for a long time. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the regret, and the determination. Slowly, she nodded. "If you mean it, then prove it. Not to me, but to her. She needs consistency more than promises." Adrian accepted those words with humility. From that moment on, he dedicated himself to proving his love not through grand gestures, but through presence. He made space in his life for Lily, real space, not just stolen minutes. He started turning down unnecessary meetings, something he would never have done before. He created a balance he had once thought impossible, because he now understood what was truly important. One Sunday, while they were at the park, Lily suddenly stopped playing and looked at him. She tilted her head in that familiar way that always reminded him of himself. "Are you my daddy?" she asked again, her voice soft but hopeful. Adrian felt his throat tighten. He knelt down so he was at her level, looking straight into her eyes. "Yes," he said gently. "I am. And I'll always be here for you." For a moment, Lily stared at him, as if trying to understand the weight of his words. Then her face broke into the brightest smile he had ever seen. She threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. "I knew it," she whispered. In that instant, Adrian felt something shift inside him. All the loneliness, all the emptiness of his past life seemed to melt away. In its place was a warmth he had never known before. The embrace of a child who had been waiting for him without even realizing it. From that day forward, Adrian's life was never the same. The world still saw him as the powerful millionaire CEO, but behind closed doors, he was something far more important: a father. His home was no longer empty, it was filled with laughter, drawings pinned to the refrigerator, and the sound of small footsteps running down the hall. And whenever he looked at Lily, he knew with absolute certainty that success was not about numbers, titles, or money. True success was measured in love, in family, and in the simple but life-changing moment when a little girl asked him, "Are you my daddy?" And he finally had the courage to say yes.